There's a specific kind of pain that nobody talks about. Not the pain of wanting something and never getting it. The pain of getting it, and then watching yourself destroy it. The relationship was real. The connection was there. And then, without a reason you could defend out loud, you ended it. Or you started a fight that didn't need to happen. Or you found a flaw that 3 weeks earlier didn't exist. The project was working. The momentum was real. And then you stopped showing up. Not because something went wrong, because something was going right. This is the pattern. And if you've lived it, you already know the cruelest part. It doesn't happen when things are bad. It happens exactly when things are about to become what you said you wanted. Most people explain this to themselves with a story about unworthiness. I don't deserve good things. Something is broken in me. I'm my own worst enemy. These explanations feel true because they match the evidence, but they are wrong about the cause. They describe the wound without touching what's underneath it. You are not sabotaging your life because you don't deserve it. You are sabotaging it because a part of your psyche has concluded, quietly, completely, years before this moment, that the life you actually want cannot be lived by the person you have learned to be, and that getting close to it means one thing. That person has to die. Carl Jung spent decades mapping the architecture of the unconscious, not as a collection of repressed desires, but as a living system with its own logic, its own economy, its own survival instinct. What he found was not a psyche that wants to suffer. What he found was a psyche that will choose familiar suffering over unfamiliar freedom every single time. Because familiar suffering at least preserves the structure. The structure is the ego, and the ego, Jung understood, is not your friend. It is your first and most sophisticated prison. What you are about to hear is not a prescription. It is a diagnosis. And if it lands the way it should, some part of you will want to stop watching, which is exactly how you'll know it's true. Here is what nobody told you about the ego. It was never designed to make you happy. It was designed to make you continuous. Jung drew a distinction that most psychology skips entirely. The ego, the I you experience when you think about yourself, the narrator of your inner life, is not the whole of who you are. It is the center of conscious awareness. It is the part that knows your name, tracks your history, maintains the story of who you've been. But it is not the self. It is a fragment of the self, organized around one primary function, keeping the structure intact. This is not a flaw. In the early years of your life, this function saved you. The ego assembled itself out of whatever materials were available, the responses that got you love, the behaviors that kept you safe, the identity that made you legible to the people who controlled your survival. It built a workable version of you from the wreckage of what your environment demanded. That took intelligence. That took adaptation. But adaptation is not the same as truth. And the structure the ego built, however functional it once was, is not you. It is a defensive formation, a scar that learned to call itself a face. Jung was precise about this in Aion. The ego is subordinate to the self, the way a part is subordinate to the whole. The ego does not contain the personality. It represents only the portion that has reached consciousness. Everything else, the deeper drives, the unlived potentials, the rejected aspects of who you could be, exists in the unconscious, outside the ego's control, pressing constantly against its borders. And here is where it becomes dangerous. The ego does not experience the unconscious as potential. It experiences it as threat. Anything that could dissolve the current structure, including genuine happiness, genuine intimacy, genuine success, registers in the ego's logic as something close to annihilation. You feel this as anxiety, as the sudden urge to exit, as the quiet voice that appears the moment things get real and says, "This is too much, this is too exposed, this is not safe." You have probably mistaken that voice for wisdom. It is not wisdom. It is the ego enforcing its own survival at the cost of yours. The tragedy Jung identified is not that people are self-destructive. It is that they are too loyal to a version of themselves that was built for a world that no longer exists, protecting a structure that was never meant to be permanent. The ego was supposed to be a vessel, not a destination. But to see what the ego is actually protecting, you have to look at what it built the structure around. Because the foundation isn't neutral, it's a wound, and the wound has become the architecture. That is what the next part is about. If this content is making sense to you, click the subscribe button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support. You did not choose your defenses. You inherited them the way you inherited your first language, before you had the words to question what you were learning. At some point early enough that you cannot fully remember it, something happened that felt like too much. Rejection, abandonment, humiliation, the withdrawal of love at the moment you needed it most. And your psyche did what psyches do. It organized itself around that event, not to commemorate it, to survive it. The wound became the center of gravity, and everything else arranged itself at a safe distance from the pain. Jung called the mask you built over this wound the persona, the face you learned to show the world in order to function within it. The word comes from the Latin for theatrical mask, and the choice was deliberate. The persona is a performance, a negotiated identity between who you are and who your environment would accept. In its early form, it is necessary. Every adult wears one. The problem is not the mask itself. The problem is what happens when the mask wears you. Because the persona, over time, stops being something you put on and becomes something you inhabit. The strategies that once protected you begin to feel like personality. The walls you built against pain begin to feel like preferences. The limitations you accepted to stay safe begin to feel like truth. And at the center of all of it, below the persona, below the ego's careful maintenance of the story, is an identity that has quietly organized itself around the wound, around the struggle, around the absence. This is why the approach of genuine happiness is not experienced as relief. It is experienced as threat. Because the happiness that is coming is not arriving into a neutral space. It is arriving into a structure that was built around its opposite. A relationship that requires real intimacy threatens an identity built on emotional distance. Success that demands full ownership threatens an identity built on victimhood and excuse. Transformation that requires change threatens an identity built on the consistency of suffering. Jung observed this with clinical precision. The self organizes around whatever has been most formative. And for most people, what has been most formative is not joy. It is the strategies they developed to manage its absence, which means that the self, as currently constructed, does not just lack room for the life you want. It is actively incompatible with it. This is what the ego is protecting when it engineers your escape. Not weakness, not laziness. A whole architecture of identity that cannot survive contact with what you say you want. The persona will crack. The story will break. And underneath it, if you stay long enough, you will have to meet whatever you built the mask to hide. That is not a small thing to ask of someone. But before you can choose it consciously, you need to see exactly what the ego is afraid of. Because the fear is not general, it is specific. And naming it is the first act of resistance. Fear is not one thing. Underneath every act of self-sabotage, there is a specific terror, not a vague anxiety, but a precise threat that the ego has identified and is working with extraordinary efficiency to avoid. Jung's framework of the shadow makes this visible. The parts of yourself you have rejected, buried, and projected outward don't disappear. They organize, they operate, and they surface as the exact panic you feel when the life you want gets close enough to touch. The first terror is the fear of greatness. not failure, greatness. Jung described what he called the refusal of the hero, the moment when the psyche, faced with the full weight of its own potential, steps back. Because living extraordinarily means surrendering the identity of someone who almost made it. As long as you haven't fully tried, the story of what you could have been remains intact. Sabotage preserves the narrative. Success destroys the excuse. And the excuse, for some people, is the last thing they have left. The second terror is the fear of being seen. Not observed, seen. The persona exists precisely to control what others receive of you. Real intimacy, real visibility, real success all involve a moment where the mask comes off, and whatever is underneath is exposed to judgment. The ego knows, at some level, that what it has been protecting is fragile. And it will destroy the relationship, abandon the project, refuse the opportunity. Anything to avoid the moment where the real self meets the real world without armor. The third terror is the fear of total responsibility. This one is quieter, but perhaps the most paralyzing. While you don't have the life you want, you have something invaluable. An explanation, circumstances, history, other people. The moment the life you want actually arrives, that explanation evaporates. Every failure from that point forward belongs entirely to you. The ego, which has spent years constructing a coherent account of why things haven't worked, will sabotage the conditions that would make that account obsolete. The fourth terror is the fear of losing the wound as identity. If you have organized your sense of self around struggle, around being someone who suffers, who fights, who endures, then healing is not liberation, it is erasure. Who are you without the thing you've been surviving? The question is not rhetorical. For many people, it is genuinely unanswerable, and the psyche will choose the known suffering over the terrifying blankness of a self not yet defined by pain. The fifth terror is unconscious loyalty to family. Jung recognized that individuation, the process of becoming fully oneself, often runs directly into the inherited patterns of the family system. If those who came before you did not prosper, did not experience intimacy, did not live fully, then your flourishing can feel, at a level beneath language, like betrayal, like abandonment. The psyche interprets surpassing the emotional inheritance of the family as a form of disloyalty, and the sabotage becomes a strange act of devotion, staying small to stay connected to those who never got to be large. The sixth terror is the fear of the ego's symbolic death. This is the one Jung returned to most insistently. Real transformation is not improvement. It is not a better version of the current structure. It is the dissolution of the current structure and the emergence of something that cannot yet be named. The ego experiences this, correctly, as a kind of dying. And it will do anything, manufacture any crisis, produce any symptom, engineer any exit, to avoid the threshold where the old identity ends and the unknown begins. These six terrors do not announce themselves. They arrive dressed as reasons, as practical concerns, as sudden clarity about why this particular relationship, this particular opportunity, this particular moment of change is not quite right. The rationalization is always convincing. It is supposed to be. The ego is not stupid. It is fluent in the language of your own values, and it will use that fluency against you with precision. But the rationalizations share a structure. They always appear at the same moment, when the life you want is close enough that staying would require you to become someone the current identity cannot hold. That timing is not coincidence. It is the signature of the terror, and recognizing it, not after the fact, but in the moment it arrives, is where the actual work begins. The ego does not announce its retreats. It disguises them as decisions. This is what makes the pattern so difficult to catch in real time. You are not aware of fleeing. You are aware of concluding that the relationship had a fundamental incompatibility you'd been ignoring. that the project wasn't aligned with your real values, that the timing wasn't right. The conclusion feels earned. It feels like clarity. It arrives with the particular calm of someone who has finally seen something true. But the calm is the tell. Real clarity about genuinely wrong situations produces grief. What the ego produces is relief. The specific, clean relief of having escaped something that was about to require everything from you. In relationships, the flight follows a recognizable sequence. The connection deepens. Vulnerability becomes real. Not performed vulnerability, not the controlled disclosure that keeps the other person at a flattering distance, but the actual exposure of something undefended in you. And then the machinery starts. You find the flaw that renders everything provisional. You create a conflict that doesn't need resolution because its real purpose is distance. You return to someone familiar and emotionally unavailable, not because they are better, but because they are safer. They will never ask you to be seen completely, because they are not fully present themselves. The ego calls this discernment. It is the persona defending its perimeter. In work and ambition, the flight arrives at the exact moment of proximity to success. Not before. Before, there is effort, there is striving, there is the comfortable identity of someone working towards something. It is when the something becomes real that the sabotage begins, the procrastination that appears only at the critical juncture, the illness that surfaces the week before the launch, the sudden re-evaluation of whether this was ever really what you wanted, a question that never arose during the years when success was still hypothetical. Jung would recognize this immediately. As long as success remains a future possibility, it poses no threat to the ego's current story. The moment it becomes a present reality, it demands a self that can inhabit it. And that self does not yet exist. In personal transformation, the flight is perhaps the most insidious, because it comes dressed in the language of the work itself. You stop therapy precisely when the sessions begin to reach something real. You return to the old pattern after months of genuine progress. Not randomly, but at the exact moment when the new pattern was about to become stable enough to be permanent. You intellectualize endlessly, reading, analyzing, understanding the psychology of your own avoidance with impressive precision, while making sure that understanding never becomes change. Because understanding can be contained within the current identity. Change cannot. What unites all three arenas is a single dynamic. The ego's intervention is always timed to the threshold, not to the struggle. The ego tolerates struggle because struggle maintains the current self. It intervenes at the crossing point, the moment where continuation would require a different person to continue. That is the moment the reasons appear. That is the moment the exit becomes visible. The practical question is not why this happens. You now know why. The question is what to do in the specific moment when the impulse to flee arrives, when the reason sounds convincing and the relief is already within reach. Jung's answer to that question does not begin with willpower. It begins with something far more difficult, turning toward the fear instead of away from it, and learning to hear what it is actually saying. That is where we go next. If what you're hearing resonates with you, you'll find real value in my ebooks. Beyond the Shadow breaks down Jung's core ideas, while Dialogues with the Unconscious gives you a 30-day path to apply them in your life. Both are linked in the pinned comment. The instinct, when the impulse to flee arrives, is to resolve it. Either surrender to it, leave, abandon, retreat, or suppress it through force of will, white-knuckling your way through the discomfort until it passes. Jung observed that both responses fail for the same reason. They treat the fear as an obstacle to be overcome rather than as information to be understood. And information ignored does not disappear, it accumulates. The first concrete thing you can do, not eventually, not after more preparation, but the next time the impulse arrives, is to stop before you act on it and name what is actually happening. Not the reason the ego is offering, the fear underneath the reason. Ask yourself, with as much honesty as you can access in that moment, what do I believe will happen if I don't leave? If this relationship continues and becomes fully real, what am I actually afraid of? If this project succeeds and I have to inhabit that success, what does that threaten? The answer will not come as an abstract concept. It will come as a physical sensation, a specific image, a particular dread. That dread is the territory. That is what you are working with. Jung developed a practice he called active imagination precisely for this kind of confrontation. The principle is disarmingly simple. Instead of fighting the part of you that wants to flee, you speak to it, not metaphorically, concretely. In writing or in stillness, you turn toward the part that is terrified and you ask it what it needs. What are you protecting me from? What do you believe will happen if I stay? What do you think I cannot survive? The part will answer, if you give it space. And what it reveals is almost never what you expected. Beneath the sophisticated rationalizations, the fear is usually ancient and specific. A child's conclusion about what happens when you are fully seen, fully committed, fully alive. A conclusion that was reasonable then and has been running the present ever since. What you do with that answer matters. You do not argue with it. You do not tell the frightened part that it is wrong, that things are different now, that it should trust you. The ego has heard that before, and it has learned correctly that such reassurances are unreliable. Instead, you acknowledge what the fear is protecting, genuinely, without condescension, and then you make a different choice in full awareness of the cost. You say, in effect, I understand what you are afraid of losing, and I am choosing to risk it anyway. Not because the fear is irrational, because the life on the other side of this threshold is worth the terror of crossing it. This is where the question of unconscious family loyalty requires something specific. If you recognize that your flight from a fuller life carries the weight of inherited limitation, that flourishing feels like abandonment of those who didn't get to, the work is not to sever that connection, but to reframe it. Write the letter Jung's framework would suggest to the people whose struggles you have been honoring through your own smallness. Tell them you are not leaving them behind by living fully. Tell them that your expansion is the realization of what they could not reach, not a betrayal of their story, but its continuation in a different register. The act of making this explicit, even privately, disrupts the unconscious contract. And when the impulse to flee arrives, and you have named the fear and chosen to stay, stay in a way that is active, not passive. Communicate the vulnerability that the flight was designed to protect. Tell the person in front of you that you are afraid. Show the work you were about to abandon. Take the step the ego was engineering a reason to avoid. Not because it will be comfortable, because each time you remain present at the threshold without retreating, you prove to the psyche that the crossing is survivable. You are not eliminating the fear. You are expanding the self that can hold it. This is not a process that completes. It is a practice that deepens. And the deeper it goes, the more it begins to touch something that cannot be addressed through technique alone. The question of who you are willing to become when the identity you have inhabited is no longer enough to contain the life that is trying to happen through you. That question is the hardest one, and it is the only one that remains. There is a version of this video that ends with hope, with the reassurance that the work is hard but worth it, that growth is painful but beautiful, that on the other side of your fear is the life you've always wanted. That version would be a lie, not because the life isn't there, but because what stands between you and it is not a challenge to be overcome. It is a death to be chosen. Jung was unambiguous about this. Individuation, the process of becoming fully oneself, is not the refinement of who you already are. It is the dissolution of who you have been. The ego does not expand to accommodate the self, it surrenders to it. And surrender, for a structure that has spent decades organizing itself around survival, is indistinguishable from annihilation. The terror you feel when the life you want approaches is not irrational. It is the ego recognizing correctly that it cannot follow you where you are going. This is the thing you have been half hoping this video wouldn't say. Because if the problem were simply fear, if it were a matter of courage, of pushing through discomfort, of learning to tolerate uncertainty, then the path forward would be difficult but navigable. You could remain who you are and simply act differently. But that is not what Jung found, and it is not what the pattern reveals. The identity built around the wound, the persona constructed for survival, the ego that engineers your escapes with such precision. These are not obstacles alongside the path. They are the path's price of entry. You cannot bring them with you. What this means, concretely, is that you will know you are genuinely changing, not when things become easier, but when something in you begins to grieve. When the old story, the one in which you are limited, undeserving, loyal to a family's ceiling, defined by what you survived, starts to feel not like truth, but like a garment you have outgrown. That grief is not weakness. It is the accurate emotional response to a real loss. Something is ending. The self that organized itself around the wound is losing its justification for existing. Let it. The psychological challenge this video leaves you with is not a list of behaviors. It is a single question you have to sit with until it becomes unavoidable. What identity are you currently protecting that the life you want would require you to release? Not in the abstract. Specifically, the story about who you are that only survives as long as you don't fully try. The wound that only remains central as long as you don't fully heal. The loyalty that only holds as long as you don't fully live. Name it. Write it down if you have to, because you cannot choose to release what you have not been willing to see. Jung believed that this confrontation, not the insight, not the understanding, but the actual moment of choosing the death of the old identity, was the most significant act available to a human being. Not because it resolves everything, because it begins everything. The self that emerges on the other side of that threshold is not a better version of the ego that crossed it. It is something that could not have existed until the ego stepped aside. If something in this video reached you, if you recognized the pattern, felt the specific weight of one of those terrors, or found yourself wanting to close the window at a particular moment, leave that in the comments. Not as confession, as evidence. Because the recognition itself is the beginning of the confrontation, and what you do with it in the next 24 hours matters more than anything else you will hear today. The work that began here does not end with this video. You already know that. Something has shifted in the way you are seeing your own pattern, and that shift will follow you into the next relationship, the next opportunity, the next moment when the exit appears and the reason sounds convincing. The question is whether you will recognize it in time. There is more to explore, and you have already started.